Thank you very much. But if anybody's got any issues with anything that is that's been recorded at the end of this session, then please do get in contact with either Julian or myself. That's totally fine. Or keep cameras off, names anonymous if you prefer. So welcome everybody. Thank you for giving up your lunchtime to join us to talk a little bit about research ethics today. So Julian's asked me to just do a little bit of an introduction to the session, and then I'll be sticking around, see what everyone's talking about, and then I'll pop in again at the end. But this has been hosted by the Evaluation Collective, and for those of you that work closely with us or may not know us, we've been around for about a year and a bit. We kind of met a kind of group of like-minded evaluation advocates, as we're calling ourselves. We kind of reject the label of experts. I don't think we are experts. We just like to talk about it. There's still loads and loads that we could learn. And then we've written some things kind of March, April last year. We put out a manifesto, and this year we've done some a response to the access and participation plan consultation with the OFS. They're both on our website, and I could pop the links on as we're moving through today. And we set out to provide a bit of a connection for the sector to conversations about evaluation and the things which were quite pertinent to folk in different spaces. So we had a session where we brought together different advocates and different people who were talking about evaluation in the same or slightly different ways. And we've also embarked on a piece of work to explore what we're called in wicked evaluation issues. So the things which, I mean, they might keep you up at night, or you might be at Glastonbury and who cares, but the things that are troubling us as a sector, I think, and we're trying to move forward, and we're trying to provide spaces to facilitate some collective problem solving. So this session came out of some of those conversations. We at Sheffield Hallam, which is myself and Julian, who's going to be facilitating most of this session today, are based. We know that we struggle with research ethics and evaluation ethics at times, both procedural, so the things we have to do to get ethics approved, but also the relational, so how we make ethical decisions in our evaluation spaces or research spaces. So that's going to be the focus of today's session. We hope that there will be some participation. We're a small group, we're a friendly group. Please do feel like you've got a space to be able to talk to us and to share your experiences. I'm going to pass over to Julian, who's going to do some expert facilitation. We've got a couple of speakers, and then we also want to hear from you. Welcome to the people that have just joined us. You've just missed me rabbiting on, nothing important. I'm going to pass over to Julian. Thanks, Julian.
That's great. Thanks loads, Liz. I'll just quickly share. I've got just a quick outline of the session today. So yeah, as Liz says, we are recording the session. So if that's a concern, please just let us know. Please feel free to introduce yourself via the chat. We're hoping that there'll be kind of many more of these sessions. It'd be great to sort of get to know people a bit more, people we don't know. And in terms of the session today, Liz has already introduced everyone to the Evaluation Collective, and then in a minute Elizabeth will do a sort of a kick-off for this stream of events by talking about research ethics, integrity and data protection. Then I'll kind of just talk a little bit about how useful I found the research ethics process in helping to clarify and refine a project that myself and Nathaniel, I think, who's in the meeting, are doing here at Sheffield Hallam University. And then just some random thoughts, really, and some random themes that sort of crop up for me when I'm thinking about research ethics in the context of data protection, which is kind of the focus of the rest of the session. And then I'm hoping we can do a bit of sort of crowdsourced thinking about data protection wicked issues in terms of ethics and things. Using a Jamboard, I think hopefully most people have used them, but I'll quickly show anyone who hasn't how that works. And basically we probably have about 20 minutes to collectively collect some wicked issues that we come up with, and also hopefully it will prompt people to share things that they've done when they face those wicked issues, so we can start collecting it, if not solutions, mitigations, responses, and those kind of things. And then we'll write that up, and that'll go up on the Evaluation Collective website as a resource, which will hopefully be useful to others. And then Liz will wrap the session up. So I shall hand over to Elizabeth to do the inaugural introduction to the theme.
Thanks very much, Julian. I didn't realise it was the inaugural introduction, so I'll have to take a different tenor to this whistle-stop tour of ethics, which is what I think it is. It's just a sort of a basic overview of some of the issues and concerns we should be thinking about when doing research with our own students or within our own institutions. Shall I share my screen, Julian? Yeah. All right, so let me see. Can you see the first slide here? Yeah. Okay. So I've turned my own view off, so I don't see, I'm not sure if you can also see lots of other things. Is it just the slides?
So yeah, we can just see the first slide, which is the title, Wicked Research Ethics.
Super.
Magnifying glass.
Super, thanks very much. Okay, so hopefully I'll be covering the basics and be able to provide some kind of basis for our discussion. So doing research with students, I think ethics are really intimately entwined with the type of methodology that we're going to use. So it can't really be separated from that. So if you're dealing with preliminary questions like what type of research are we doing, and what the research, and thinking about the research questions that we're trying to answer, you may just start out with purely statistical overview of student demographics, looking at the data that's collected from students when they apply or they matriculate, and having a look at data held on assessments during their course, when they're on course or at their final grades. So this may be a purely statistical overview of the student demographics, and you may be answering a preliminary question, something like, what does the awarding gap look like at my institution? So your ethical concerns with this then relate directly to the sensitive data that you're collecting and how to protect this. So here you have an obligation under the 2018 Data Protection Act, which is to do with the secure storage of data, how long that data is stored, how it's anonymized, not releasing that data where the numbers are statistically small for the students who are captured in them to be identified as a result. And this is particularly pressing if you've got data, which all of us have, to do with race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. So any personal characteristics, including sort of name and your IP address, that all comes under that. So however complex your questions and sophisticated your analysis of this data may be, your main issue then is just protecting others' information and not sharing this. So it's confidentiality. Your only other concern is if you have a role in the university that means you may actually know these students and you may know whose data you're manipulating. And in this case, you may be aware of a conflict of interest, which you need to acknowledge to your line manager or to someone senior to yourself and think how you're going to manage it. So that's the potentially wicked issue there. So a lot of that type of research is covered under the student contract. That's the agreement that students sign when they matriculate at the university. There's usually a section in that contract that states something along the lines as this is in the legitimate interest of the institution, and so students sign up to having their data processed for this purpose. And I think that, you know, this is pretty fair and square, especially when analysing these types of existing records and very basic data we hold about students. Unless, of course, you decide to do a project where other students or members of the university or academics also have access to this data, in which case you have to be extra careful about data protection, anonymizing the information before other students see it, for example, to make sure nobody can be recognized. And this is especially important if you've got small cohorts or if people of diverse backgrounds are a really small minority in your institution, which they probably are if it's anything like ours. So this is also about thinking about conflicts of interest, students who may know other students or academics who may know students. And so those are sort of the sort of starting point for thinking about research, in-house research or an in-house research inquiry. So the big question is what, who, for, when and how are we doing this? So going back to the methodology question of why we're doing the research, is it about students? Is it going to be with them, or is it going to be just on them? And the stats example is an instance of it being just on them rather than with them. So let's have a think about other methods that you might use. So you might use a survey, and for this you might have closed or open questions. And here I'd say this is more of a quantitative method that you're using with a bit of a qualitative flexion. And this could also arguably go under the student contract, but others may say that it wouldn't, and you need to have informed consent in order to do this. So this is because you're directly engaging students, you're asking them questions, whether they're closed or open, and I'd recommend sort of best practice here is to have a formal ethical review. So let me just check I'm still on this. Yeah. Okay, so good practice is formal ethics and risk management. So whatever type of methodology you're going to use, if it is survey, interview, randomized controlled trial, focus group, ethnographic study, participant observation, appreciative inquiry, any of the types of methods that we're accustomed to using, you're going to want to go for the formal ethical review route. This is what is recommended. Many of the departments at our institutions have their own ethical review board, or you have a central ethical review board where you can put your project into. And it's really worth going through this process because it helps you think about what can be involved when you're doing the research, and it can also help you manage the risks. So let's have a little look at that in a bit more detail. So who's the approving body? As I said, it could be departments, a division, somebody central, and there you're going to think about all of the process involved in putting together your project, of how you're going to collect the data, how you're going to manage it, and how you're going to recruit students. And this can be an increasingly complicated process, even for more experienced researchers. I think it's got more and more complicated each year. I've looked at the ethical guidelines by our institution, and we have a template that we fill in, and it's become longer and longer by the pages every academic year. So normally your institution has made this easy for you, and they've given you example answers, or they've given you links to help you fill in some of the associated forms that you need to attach to any ethical approval. So an information sheet, consent forms, examples of comms. And it's probably worth pairing up with somebody who's done this before and to get some advice on how to do it, because it can be a bit bewildering if it's the first time you're going through the process. So it does help you think about the process. It helps you think about what you really need to record and transcribe. It helps you think about the messages that you're sending out, how you're going to recruit students, the language that you're using, where you're going to recruit them. These kind of things are attachments to our ethical review process, and I'm sure you have something similar at your own institution. So we provide examples of the emails we're going to send out, the comms and newsletters, and think about how to capture interest, as well as telling students whether they're going to be compensated or not for their time. Part of this also involves putting together a participant information sheet. So you're running students through everything that they're going to do in order to participate in the research. You're going to give them some information on the benefits and risks, as well as the process of what's going to happen to them if they sign up, and if they voluntarily choose to participate in the project. So it's a really useful thing to do. And it's part of good practice. At the end of this comes the informed consent, where you get them to sign a form and date it, and to let you know that they've understood the process, that they can contact you at any time, that they can withdraw if they need to, that it's completely voluntary. And you also state there whether you're going to pay them for their time, which is part of good practice, and whether this be in terms of payments in kind, honorariums or vouchers, or another way of compensation. So in that informed consent, you'll also be talking about data protection. That's normally covered there. You're going to tell the people who you're working with how you're going to protect their data, and how long you're going to store the data for before you delete it. Normally it's about 5 years. You may store only anonymized data. You probably have it on a secure database. It may be encrypted, and you have to think about what types of data you really need and to store, whether it's absolutely necessary to have it or not. So, for example, you may have an institutional subscription to Microsoft, which we have, and that's approved by our institution. It's a secure place to store data for us, and us as an institution, we're the data holder. So we're responsible for holding and storing the data. All that falls under our remit, and you'll have policies on how best to do this and where best to do this. And this also goes for the methods that you're using to collecting information about students. So whether you're setting up a survey or you're having an online interview, you probably want to use the approved data collection means. So you might use Microsoft Forms rather than Google Forms, because this is more data secure. We use Teams for online interviews rather than Zoom or Skype. And it's worth mentioning that some providers store their data outside of the UK. So this for Oxford is a problem. We can't use those to do to ethically carry out our research. And you also need to think about WhatsApp and other media and platforms and where they keep and store their data. So this may not be immediately obvious to you. You may have to do some research, but there's nearly always guidelines around where to find out where data is being held. So some general principles then for protecting data and informed consent is always using your work or professional email, having a dedicated mobile if you need to use your mobile phone for this type of research and not using your own mobile, and creating dedicated research WhatsApp groups or other types of groups that aren't there, so there's no sort of crossover with other types of functions that you may have with the same group of people. So they should be dedicated to the project. So this is also the case if you're joining pre-established groups of students. You need to ask, you need to agree you need to agree to join before you join them. You need to ask the organizer or administrator. You need to be introduced to the group, and you can't ask for group approval. You can't ask for the whole group to just sign you off and say, yeah, that's fine, I can join. You need to ask every individual personally for this to be sort of ethically integral. What else? Thinking about how you might do this online interviews, some basic stuff of if you haven't got a good reason to video record it, don't do an audio recording. If you haven't got a good reason to audio record it, don't just take notes. I'm just looking through my notes here. And these are things to also remember when using different types of Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. So you have to remember that if you're using some of this data that's on apparently public forums, that's a student blog that everyone can see, you still need, and you want to use that information to find out more about student experience, you still need to go to the owner of that site and ask them for their permission to use it for research purposes. So that's something that's especially wicked about doing research with digital media and on the internet. And I think some of the best practice here in terms of doing the right thing when we're carrying out research is to ask those questions. So there isn't a set of guidelines that covers it all. The terrain is always changing. We raise a lot more questions than we have answers to. Okay, so I've covered sort of the approving body, informed consent, think about the process, data management. Just talk briefly then to risk management and risk assessment. Normally as part of your ethical review, you'll also have a look at the risks involved in undertaking the research. Sometimes there's a template for this as well, sometimes there's not. And I think the main ones for us on student research are mental health risks caused by bringing up issues that may trigger memories or other issues. So you want to make sure you know where to direct students, whether it's counselling services, and how you yourself are going to respond to them. And you may have to put this down on your ethics form as well. So we have lots of great codes of conduct that help orientate us about what's the right thing to do, how to behave in different situations and circumstances. These come from professional bodies. The most relevant for our purposes today is the British Educational Research Association Ethical Guidelines for Educational Research, but there are many others, and you may be asked to cite these on your ethics form. And that you can also undergo some research integrity training. This is often offered by institutions, or there's other guidance that's given to think about the difference between this more formal ethical review and the more informal way you conduct yourself with regards to your data and how you relate to the people who you're working with. Often this is signposted as part of the informed research process. Okay, so research integrity. So we have a number of duties and obligations to conduct good research. Your institution has policies, guidance, and probably offers lots of training like this research integrity. There's also courses, textbooks, journals, and lots of other codes of conduct other than the educational one I've already mentioned. And you can also talk to your supervisor, your line manager, mentor, or peers and ask if you have any concerns. So one of the key things about research integrity is sticking to being transparent, sticking to the facts and accepted methods, not fabricating, falsifying, or plagiarizing data, and knowing that there are procedures in place for misconduct for yourself and for others who you're working with. There's the UK Research Integrity Office, which you can contact to find out more about this. But I think it gets a little bit more tricky when we're thinking about questionable research design. So this is slightly more nuanced, and this can relate to irresponsibility that's caused by inadequate methods. The best way to overcome this is sort of asking yourself the question, have I explored alternative methods? Have I properly looked into the way I'm going to do this and why? So going back to that how, what, why, and when question. And an example may also be just keeping inadequate records. You know, that's if you don't keep proper records of your research and you don't fully anonymize your research, these are all sort of questionable practices as well as potentially being data breaches. So I've mentioned earlier compensating participants. This isn't an ethical issue per se, but it is an integrity issue, and it is good practice across the sector now to compensate students for their time. Informal ethics, this is my last slide. So I just wanted to speak briefly then to thinking about your position and how you situate yourself. So this is all about our relationships with people when we're doing research, especially when we're doing the more, when we move away from statistical analyses and from surveys, and we're actually engaging with students. And this is about maintaining relationships and maintaining respectful relationships and being aware of your position, which is normally a powerful position with respect to the student. And this can reflect on how you position yourself in a room. You know, I've heard of researchers who will sit on the floor rather than up on the podium just to try and outweigh their relative position of power with respect to the students who they're engaging with, or the type of interaction or methodology you may be using. So it may be more appropriate to have an informal conversation walking along the street rather than having students sit down and have a focus group. So that may be more appropriate or more relatable to their own experience and a better way to engage them. So this question of informal ethics, it depends on who you are, how you speak, what you look like, and having a bit of awareness of that in relation to other people. And being aware of this and trying to reflect that in the design or the methodology you're using is really great for your research project. It helps with your findings, but it's also really good for the people involved. So I hope I've covered some of the main points today. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks loads, Elizabeth. Covered loads of ground there. And really, I think that the focus on student-based research was really helpful and sort of speaks to some of the concerns of the Evaluation Collective. So yeah, I think that's great because you've actually mentioned a lot of things I was going to mention. So I'll just quickly talk through my experience of the research ethics process and how it helped me to tighten a project up. And then I think we can go straight into the crowdsourcing. It's worth saying actually that if, you know, Elizabeth raised so many really useful and, you know, valuable points. If there's things that crop up as we go through or that you picked out of Elizabeth's talk and you think they'd make a good session for us to concentrate in future. We're also crowdsourcing ideas for sessions and focus and stuff. So please jot stuff down in the chat and we'll pick those up and hopefully be able to run a session in future on them. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen again, just to sort of talk through my own experience of research ethics. And I joined Sheffield Hallam University last September, and this was my first project. And the research ethics process at Sheffield Hallam is really thorough, very robust, and it was a really helpful process to go through. And I think, you know, we have to acknowledge that it's not always the fun part of research, and there's a lot of kind of administration and form filling and, you know, crossing T's and dotting I's, which, you know, that's not my favorite thing. But being forced to do that, really helped develop the project. Actually, this is a co-research project with Nathaniel Pickering at SHU. But I sort of did the research ethics as my sort of induction in getting a feel for the research culture here. And there were a number of things that fell out of the process. One of the first things was there's a very comprehensive data plan, and it actually raised a number of issues that I hadn't considered, and it was really helpful to work through some of those. So obviously there's kind of stuff about data requirements, but also raising the ethical concern that you may not need to collect the data if stuff already exists. Then, you know, why force research participants to provide data or to be involved when you don't need to? So they did sort of, you had to do a bit of an audit to see whether any of the things you're interested in already exist. Data sustainability was another really useful issue, I thought, in terms of, you know, the way that certain formats of data can become old-fashioned or not supported anymore, and you could actually lose data. So we had to account for how we made sure that data was would be open and available long term. And it also encouraged us to think about what kind of data we produce at each stage in the research. And that was actually a really helpful process to go through and make sure that we had complete alignment between each stage of the research and what data we expected to produce, you know, in terms of format, but also content things as well. And that enabled us to create a really structured plan. So it's worth saying, actually, that this research we're doing is an evaluation of simulated placements for BA nursing students. And we wanted to do sort of co-production with students and staff. So we have 2 advisory groups on that. And it really helped us think about, okay, if we're going to take stuff to the advisory group, what do we get out of each stage? So we can start thinking about how we ethically package that data up so it can be looked at. The data plan also asks us about thinking about metadata and how we're going to organize the data in files and folders and things like that. And another aspect that it is actually I've noted as a potential wicked issue is the university is very keen on making anonymized data available for other researchers. Again, it's avoiding that ethical issue of collecting data you don't need to. And that to me seems like a bit of a wicked issue in the sense of you want to be clear, as Elizabeth said, you want to be clear to your participants exactly what you're going to use the data for and why you're collecting it. But the suggestion from this data plan was that you, if possible, sought consent to share anonymized data with other researchers so it could be used. And so that was kind of really helpful. And I think, well, we can talk about that when we come to think about wicked issues. One of the ethical issues that cropped up and really came to light is because we were forced to nail down all the practical arrangements, we knew we wanted these advisory groups. And I think initially we thought we'd have a single advisory group comprised of staff and students. But when we were thinking about it ethically, we wondered what would happen, you know, if the kind of power relationships that Elizabeth was talking about. You've got your tutor in a working group, you know, how's that going to feel for a student? And also in the event, we found that the staff and students had quite different perspectives and views, and it was really helpful to keep those completely separate. So we were able to get an unimpeded set of data or set of thinking from both groups. As I said, you know, the outcome was a kind of a really detailed project plan, much more detailed than I probably would have done otherwise. We had to consider, you know, put a lot of thought into how we recruit students, and you know, the kind of backup plans if the recruitment didn't generate the students we wanted. We had to finalise all the information sheets and consent forms, which again is really helpful as a kind of a sense check to make sure that you've got your research questions covered, and you're making sure that you're explicitly asking for consent for the information that you want. Because we were using a kind of relatively, well, for me, new research method, most significant change approach, we also included a methodological note for context for the research reviewer, in case, you know, that they were sort of, you know, a quant reviewer and it was unfamiliar, just to help them make informed decisions about the ethics of the approach. And I think, you know, it was my first time through. I really wanted to get it through with no amendments. So I really worked hard to try and, you know, nail down every possible loose end. And I did, you know, we did get it through and were able to get cracking with the project. So that was great. I then was going to talk a bit about research ethics and data protection and how they interact. But I think Elizabeth has covered that really well, which is great because it means we can go straight on to the kind of crowdsource element of the session. And, you know, as we said at the beginning, what we'd like to do is collect thinking from across the sector, from everyone here, about the kind of wicked issues that you come across when you're thinking through research ethics, particularly in the context of data protection issues. And I've created a Jamboard. I'm just going to share that in the chat. So hopefully you will get, it'll be easy for you to join, and I've put the right settings on. It's worth saying, actually, if you've not used Jamboard before, you are anonymous, so you'll be given an anonymous spirit animal. So do feel free to kind of be honest and share your thinking. And what I'm going to suggest is that we use yellow post-it notes for wicked issues that we come across. And then if you've got kind of responses or ideas or solutions to those wicked issues, to use green post-it notes, and that'll just help us when we write up, because we can bring them together. Do please comment on the post-it notes as they emerge. And, you know, hopefully we can get a bit of a dialogue going, and, you know, then we'll write up the outcomes and share it on the Evaluation Collective website. I'm going to stop sharing now, and what I will do. So I was thinking what I'd do is I'd put the Jamboard up on screen so everyone could see it. Probably if you've only got one screen or you're working with one screen, you'll just have the Jamboard you're working on. And I'll just sort of, you know, provide a really irritating live commentary about what's going on by way of ideas and comments. If that does become too irritating and distracts you, just let me know and I'll shut up and put some gentle music on. So I shall share the Jamboard now, hopefully. So hopefully you can see that, but I'm imagining many of you will just have your own Jamboard up. I've pre-populated with some just to get the ball rolling, although I don't think we're going to have any problem with the rate stuff. So one of the things was, one of the wicked issues that occurred to me was you've got a brilliant bit of data and it transforms your research, but it's so specific that it's impossible to ensure the anonymity of the research subject can be maintained. What would you do in that situation? How would you circle that square that circle? Another issue was, and this happened, you know, I think we've all been here, emerging data actually suggests a really exciting new area of research or thinking that you hadn't anticipated, but it would require reusing the data for other purposes than you'd specified in the original consent form and the information form. What do you do in that situation? Another issue, there's some really helpful resources by the University of Reading, which I drew on actually. And some of one of the points they raised was, you know, suppose you collect data in the form of a video or something else, and it's almost impossible to anonymize participants in that sense. What do you do in that circumstance? Yeah, and this is something both I know Elizabeth talked about and Liz discussed in the chat. You want to use a standard student record data for research purposes, but you're not sure if this use is covered in the data agreement with students. And that might be something we want to unpick. So one of this is something that, again, that the University of Reading raised, and it's obviously good practice to, or it's ethically right to tell participants how you're going to use their data and how long you're going to retain it for. And I know that, you know, that sometimes it's a kind of, it feels like you should give them a date, a cut-off point. Yeah, we'll keep it for 6 months or 2 years. And the University of Reading said that in some ways it's better not to specify a particular cut-off point, but to institute a regular review of data and decide which needs to be deleted at that point. So, you know, the wicked issue that occurred to me was, suppose you've collected data and you've told participants that you delete it and destroy it after 3 years, and then 2 days before that deadline you get offered a really exciting book chapter for which you can use the data you've collected, but you've committed to destroying it. How do you resolve that particular wicked issue? You'll notice I've not put any solutions down. Oh, and this is another live issue, and it crops up quite a lot, in that you know, we work closely, particularly when we're working with students. We want to acknowledge participants and their contribution to the research, but we also need to protect their identity. How do we balance that particular issue? So those are the kind of, those are some of the things that cropped up to me. So I'll now leave it open, and hopefully just please add your thoughts, your wicked problem solutions. You've not used Jamboard before. You just click on the sticky note button here, and you can change the color at the top. Just type and then save it, and it will pop up on the board. And as we go, I'll kind of just move them around. I'll also increase the size of the Jamboard so that people can see it. So over to you. We are starting to get solutions come through, which is brilliant. That's a really interesting wicked issue on the whiteboard. There's a real power divide between ethics committee and researchers. Whilst I'm all for research ethics, the process can become very political. Yeah, that's a really interesting issue to think about. And I suppose there's also the related issue where a reviewer may have methodological. It's very, sometimes it's quite hard for a reviewer to distinguish between the ethical and the methodological. So they might sort of push back on some of the methodological approaches, and then there's a kind of negotiation as to whether it's an ethical issue or not. So getting some sort of potential solutions. So the data that transforms into research but is impossible to anonymize. One of the sort of suggested responses is consult with the research participant and consider the risks involved with them, and who might be able to identify them, and what the implications are, and how that might be possible to limit it. I think that yeah, it's that kind of informed involvement of participants. So we've got the issue of suddenly discovering a whole new really exciting area of your research, and one of the potential resolutions or actions would be to submit an amendment to your original research ethics and try and get that approved. And then someone else has suggested that you might actually need to get renewed consent from the participants, which is potentially easier if you're still working with them, but much harder if it's after the event. So the issue around the video that shows participants and is unable to anonymise, someone suggested the potential for sharing an anonymised transcript rather than the video, which is helpful. I think whether that's particularly an issue for research where there's a visual component to the data. And the issue of using standard student data sets, someone suggested that talking to the information governance team, use this as an interpretation on the privacy policy and making sure that you're in line with your institutional kind of policy and perspective. Yeah, I mean, this to me is one of it is a real wicked issue when we're doing student focused research, because it's obviously a really important element of the contract with students, but retrospectively there's always potentially more things that we might want to do with that data. So we've got a book chapter just when you're about to delete your data, and again this is someone suggested that you need to re-seek consent from participants to reuse the data, but they're in an institution or a place where they keep anonymized data for 10 years. So I guess it speaks to what the Sheffield Hallam's data protection plan suggested, which is try to balance informed consent and ethical responsibility to research participants, but also leave an openness for that data to be reused. And as Elizabeth was saying, that's probably anonymization is a key element of ensuring that you can do that ethically. And then this again it's provide an amendment to your research ethics proposal to describe how you can use that data and try and get renewed approval. So I'm hoping that we solve this one, because it is always I'm always struggling with this one. So this is the issue around acknowledging participants and contributions, but protecting anonymity. So one of the suggestions is that provide flexibility that some participants can be named and have their contribution recognised, while others can opt to remain anonymous. So that's kind of that's handing that to the participants themselves to make a decision about how they would like to be treated in terms of their research outputs. And it would need to be in agreement with the participants and also specified in the information and consent forms across the group. Yes, so this is a kind of a subset, and this was an issue for us in our simulated placement research, in that we've got students talking to each other and they're potentially talking about confidential things. So it's making sure that that's flagged at the outset so that research participants know their own responsibility in terms of not sharing informational data outside of the research process. And that's discussing with participants an opt-in to waive their anonymity at the end of the project. At the end of the project, so not the beginning, so they know what they've said and are wavering. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's that thing of being truly informed because they've been through the research process. I think that's a really, really useful point. So in terms of the power divide between ethics committee and researchers, so the kind of one of the suggestions or solutions is that there's a need for training or training is provided where reviewers, committees and researchers come together and actually talk about the reality of the process and work through the issues. And that hopefully will be a way of dissipating some of the politics. Distinguishing what can be covered by business as usual insight work and when we need to go down the ethical approval pathway. Yeah, is this the kind of thing where there's an exemption for service evaluation. Sometimes some institutions do that, and so it doesn't require research ethics, even though practically the issues for participants are likely to be the same, irrespective of the research process. So someone's noted that for them is a key issue. The ideal might be always to seek ethics approval. This may not be realistic for everyone, particularly if you're working in a professional service role, or you need a quick turnaround, or those kind of things. Yeah, and then someone said, I'd like the formal research ethics process to work for all, to be inclusive of types of research and researchers, rather than having different processes for different contexts. So that's a kind of almost a process end focus, and thinking about how to make research ethics work for everyone, and not just be a kind of formal process. So yeah, and someone else said always go with good practice guidelines, even when it's classed as business as usual. So always having that kind of foreground in the ethical issues. So someone else has said that in their institutional context, they defined low risk projects and identified basic safeguards. Our research ethics committee agreed that projects that meet this definition and implement safeguards won't need formal approval. I know some institutions do a sort of almost like a block approval. So they might approve, where there's a standard format of research project or purpose, then they kind of get that approved. And then as long as you stick within that framework, you're covered by the research ethics, which is, it saves work, but I guess there's always a risk there. And it's that kind of, I mean, another wicked issue, I guess, which we've sort of addressed in some of the others, is where you need to change tack midway through a research process, often because of recruitment issues, and talking to different, for us, for the simulated placement, we were talking to different students than we'd anticipated with different experiences, and it actually changed the nature of the data we were collecting. We used to have low risk ethical approval, but that's now not an option. So we have to go through the whole ethical process, but it's a good approach. It is, isn't it? It's no pain, no gain, I guess. Wow, come in thick and fast. It's worth saying, actually, I'll leave the Jamboard open for a while, say 3 years. So if there's stuff after the session that you want to add, or something occurs to you, please do add it, and then I'll write it up in a couple of weeks' time. So you've got kind of a 2-week window to keep, if sort of something strikes you. I want to work on a collaborative, make this the last one actually, so we can wrap up, because I know Liz and I are probably very hungry and looking forward to sandwiches. I want to work on a collaborative project with another HEI organisation, external evaluator, and need to share student data with them. I didn't talk about it. In the slides which we will share, I've included a link to a blog by a colleague of ours at Sheffield Hallam, Lucy Clegg, who's a researcher in the inclusion and education department, and she's written a brilliant blog about the benefits and the challenges of working cross-institutionally on student data, and she's provided some really good advice. So once we get the slides out, I recommend looking at Lucy's blog. Data sharing agreements, yeah, that's a really important, a really helpful point. Start this process as early as possible and identified in the proposal bid. It can take ages, yeah. And where consent can't be obtained, discuss if the data is really needed. If so, discuss what you would need the data for, and if there's a lawful basis for using it. Only share anonymized data. I think that again is that kind of wicked issue around collecting unnecessary data is something I think a lot about, and it's easy at the input stage to collect loads of data, but then have stuff you don't use. If the data is fully anonymized, is it subject to the same data protection requirements? Is there an ethical issue if it's anonymized and used in the spirit of what it was consented for? That's a really interesting point. And again, if you're able to come back to the Jamboard at any point over the next couple of weeks and you want to expand on some of these points, I think that will be really helpful. So that's brilliant. Thanks loads for all your engagement and all your thinking. I'll write it up and we'll share it back. I will stop sharing and hand over to Liz now.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, I was busy kind of typing away to try and put stuff in, and there's absolutely loads more that I could probably add. So maybe I'm going to go and grab a sandwich and carry on adding my little blue squares and my yellow squares to that Jamboard. So just to finish off by saying thank you. One of the kind of principles of the Evaluation Collective is that we don't just assume what people want to know, but we have this kind of ethos of crowdsourcing and learning from the sector about what the kind of challenges and issues are in the work that we're doing, and that yeah, we don't often propose to have the answers, but collectively we might be able to uncover some of the things. I think some of the things that people have been posting on that Jamboard have really I think it pushes you to think differently when you get very much embedded in your own institutional processes. And, oh, that's how we do it here. But actually what we might need is a little bit of, well, that's how other people do it and that works fine. And we can kind of interrogate our practices by learning from others as well. So that's incredibly helpful. What we want to do in September, I think now, is run some more of these sessions, picking up on the things that you've identified today. So in addition to kind of writing this up and providing some something for you to take away from your participation, so making sure that this is reciprocal, we will also put some sessions on where we will focus down on some of these wicked issues and have a conversation about them, some input, and then think if we can create some collective solutions. It's been fascinating. I don't think this is something that we can crack in an hour. We probably need a whole year. I don't think that this is something that we should all be dealing with alone either, because it does seem like we're all having very, very similar issues in very similar circumstances. And for me, that kind of ethical issue of, protect our students, do no harm, is always at the centre of what we're thinking about when we're working in institutions. And we don't want to put barriers in place for good quality research, but we also want to make sure that we're not, as Elizabeth said, taking advantage of our positions of power or being exploitative or not recognising where there are ethical concerns. Fab. Thank you ever so much. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for your input on the Jamboard. Please do carry on and carry on engaging with the Evaluation Collective. We have a mailing list, and that's a great way to keep in contact with people of things that you might want to hear about and sessions we might be running from the autumn onwards. So thanks. Always a pleasure, everyone. Yeah, thank you. Cheers. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everybody else. Bye-bye.